As technology continues to advance, its role in safeguarding elections cannot be overstated. From the bimodal voter accreditation system, BVAS, that ensures only accredited voters participate, to the electronic transmission of results via INEC results viewing portal, technology is shaping the future of our electoral process. However, as we have seen in recent elections, there are challenges that must be addressed. Delays in upload of results and concerns about the integrity of these systems has sparked important conversations about how we can better leverage technology to enhance transparency and build trust in our elections. Tonight, on Electoral Reform Half Hour, we'll take a closer look at how technology is shaping elections, the hurdles we face, and what can be done to improve the integrity of our electoral processes. I am Ezenwawagu. Thank you for joining us. Tonight on the program, we have Samson Itodo, a lawyer, executive director of Yaga Africa, with over close to 2 decades experience in governance and reforms, electoral governance, and indeed civic engagement. He is also the principal partner at Election Law Center and the founding convener of the Not Too Young to Rot movement. Sam, it's good to have you here.
Thanks, always a pleasure.
Thank you so very much. Now, we're coming to that point in the process where a lot of discussion is going around transmission of results. And I know that apart from the fact that you work in Yaga Africa, you have vast experience also internationally. You've listened to Honorable Wivey Francis and his proposal on transmission of what are your thoughts around that?
Well, thanks. Let me commend you for this discussion around reforms, because we have not been put in these debates in the public space around some of the issues that we need to deal with as we think about reforms to our electoral process. So thanks for the invitation. When you think about electoral technology and electronic transmission of results, I think there are 2 fundamental problems that plague elections, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. One is a challenge of efficiency, and the second is about trust. And so when you're thinking about electoral technology, you're thinking about how does technology help you, speed up your process, whilst also ensuring the quality of the process. But also, how does it deepen trust? And so one of the things that drive trust is transparency. The more open that people can see, the better, and they trust the outcomes of those elections. And so I'm totally in agreement that there's a great need, to amend our laws to allow for electronic transmission of result, because what it does is it opens up the process and makes it less opaque. But there are challenges, with that. Like everything, there are pros and cons in that regard. But I think the argument put forward by Honorable Francis is one that should be adopted.
What is he talking about? Is he talking about electronic collation or electronic transmission?
Now,
because the challenge is you have upload. The current what you have is upload of results into a server. Now, even if it says transmission, okay, if it is not electronically collated, if it is still a board, then what then is the value for that, for the amendment?
I think it's important for Nigerians to be clear and about some of these discussions. That when you think about collation and to say what's the current jurisprudence for electoral technology or results management, the current, practice in Nigeria is that the voting process, the process of casting votes, is manual. That's why you still receive, ballot papers, and you still thumbprint and put on the ballot box. The process of counting those ballot papers is still manual. That's why at the end of voting, the polling officials, they will do what? Sort the ballot papers, they will count them, and they will record them. All those processes are manual. The collation process is manual, based on the provisions of the Electoral Act, but also the provisions of INEC guidelines. And the Supreme Court, has ruled to the effect that you have a collation system, but you also have a results viewing portal. And what the IREF seeks to do is just to allow the public to view, the results. That's what the courts have decided. So collation is still manual, but transmission of those results, you can also transmit manually. You can also transmit electronically. Because what you currently have within our own process is transmission. Transmission simply means the process of moving one thing from one point to another. That is transmission, and that process can be manual, that process can be electronic. The reason why you say electronic is to achieve two things. One is to help you bridge, those hiccups that you might find along the way when you are manually transmitting results. So if you're going to move results from point A or from this point to this point, before I get to that point, there might be some human interference with that. But electronic transmission helps, it accelerates the process, so it gets to you faster than it would have if it were manually done. But that also has its own process, it has its own challenges, because technology can also be intercepted, especially when you don't have enough defense systems. So I think that it is important to have those electronic transmission in such a way that people can view, but electronic collation, which is what a lot of people thought that the system that we have was going to do. The current IREV is not a collation system, because within our laws, collation is still manual. If the laws are changed to allow for electronic collation,
is that something we have to do? Is that somewhere we have to go to? Because I know this confusion will continue as far as it's called electronic transmission of results.
Yeah.
Because people can't probably take out the orange from the apple in terms of what you are talking about. What are we going to advocate for? Electronic collation.
Absolutely.
So that can be, transparent and open to. Is that what YV is talking
I think
about?
it's important to have this at the back of our minds, that there is no system, whether manual or electronic, that is not susceptible or can be susceptible to human interference. All of these processes can be captured by humans. So let's keep that at the back of our minds, that none of them is actually fireproof. But what we should advocate for is
or what we're advocating for.
Or what we're advocating for is the manual collation and the electronic collation, so that both can serve as a check. But whatever you do, there has to also be an audit system. So for instance, if you say you want electronic collation, and the danger that I must point out is often I hear people advocate for 100% electronic transmission of results, 100% electronic collation of results. There's a huge danger in that. You can't surrender your electoral process, to technology alone. You need an audit system. And so the manual and collation need to go hand in hand. And this is why in terms of the reforms that we need, is the National Assembly needs to ensure that they address the ambiguity in the law as it relates to results management. Collation, transmission, all that needs to be clearly stated in the law in a way that there's a handshake between the manual and the electronic, that none substitutes the other, but they are all going to be mutually reinforcing. And that way you can deepen the quality, of the results management process.
So riding on that is also the resounding call for electronic voting. After the 2023 election, there is need for electronic voting, and people are making incredible comparisons with the what do you call it, the bank
BVN and
transactions and all of that. That since we have different identities, you could just walk in and vote, and that if it is possible to do those transactions in the bank, why can't we do that with our elections? And you just came back from the NBA conference where you presented a paper. They also talk about NBA also does electronic voting, and they talk about other organizations that have taken ICANN and the rest of them all doing electronic voting. How feasible do you think this is for our own, general elections or even governorship elections?
I think for small-scale elections, you can adopt electronic voting. NBA can do that because of the number of people who cast their votes, less than 50,000 people who vote at the end of the day. But even that process itself is also a subject of legal contestation. So the current law allows for voting with voting devices. Kaduna State not just experimented, they did deploy electronic voting. But if you look at a country like Nigeria with our vast population, first, the question of cost. If you think about the costs of procuring one EVM, one electronic voting machine, in all our 174 or 176,000 polling units, the cost will be too much, to bear. The second is the practical reality of it. And I dare say that I don't think that as a country that is what we should do at this moment. I think we should still adopt the current practice, which is, yes, the open secret ballot where people show up, because democracy is about showing up. When you show up at the polling unit, it's an expression that you do what? You still subscribe to these democratic values, because elections are a democratic festival. When people begin to clamor for things like electronic voting, they need to look at the context and whether as a country we can. You don't compare elections with NBA elections. Don't compare elections with banking transactions. If you check the number of people who actually have bank accounts, it's less than 20% of the entire population. So I don't think it's actually.
No, I understand that. We're going on a stretch of break, but before we do, 96 point something million prospective registered voters. INEC was said to have spent about $6 per voter in 2023. Now, if you put that together, do you think that technology could be of any help in reducing costs? Because I heard you loud and clear about issue around costs, especially in trying to disaggregate and make us understand this.
No, so one gets $6 per voter, and when you think about that cost, is the cost of the voter's card, is the cost of the ballot papers. So each voter gets 5 ballot papers, right? In a general election. You also think about people who are reprinting PVCs. Now, my sense is that technology can help reduce cost in certain areas, but then the cost of those machines are quite high, to the extent that when you think about it, that all we deployed for the 2023 elections was a BVAS machines, and the budget for that election was about 305 billion naira. If you're going to go electronic, yes, it might reduce the cost of the ballot papers, because rather than have 5 ballot papers, you'll be thumb printing on a machine, but the machine itself will still need to print. It needs to print the paper that would, because maintaining an audit trail also requires printing those papers. So there are cost issues. Yes, it might reduce, but if you look at it, is it statistically significant? That's a matter of debate.
Well, is it significant statistically? We'll go on a short break, and when we return, electoral reform half hour will continue.
The electorates, internal democracy, credible process, independent umpire, security, and the rule of law. These are the catalysts that propel free, fair and credible elections. Join us every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. on NTA News 24 as we X-ray, dissect and analyze the various components of electioneering and the prospects of democratic consolidation in Nigeria. Electoral Reforms Half Hour, brought to you by Peering Advocacy and Advancement Center in Africa, PACA, in conjunction with NTA News 24 and support from MacArthur Foundation. Keep a date with us every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and repeat broadcast Sunday at 2:30 p.m. on our various platforms. Don't miss it.
Sam, you've traveled extensively, and I do know that as you go around, you possibly would cherry pick. There are things that you have seen that, technology-wise, in spite of the nuanced manner in which you are asking us to embrace it, but I think there are things that we can also, you possibly have come in contact with that could be helpful for us in Nigeria in improving our electoral process.
Yeah, so let me talk about the recent elections that Yaya Africa covered with the South African elections. So since we're talking results management, so in the South African Electoral Commission, their process is such that they deploy technology. It's not electronic transmission, but they have a results viewing portal similar to ours. But when the results, go to the district office, the South Africans have what they call an independent audit system. Now, the independent audit system is one where independent auditors are required to audit the results before they are released. And what is interesting is that these auditors audit the results. They have APIs that they share with the political parties, with media organizations, and the Electoral Commission. And once the results have been audited, everybody gets the results at the same time. So that's the level of openness and transparency. And where there are errors, then they flag it for the Electoral Commission to resolve. So that's one thing. The second is about early voting. In the South African electoral process, they've got early voting, what you call special voting. So they go to as far as hospitals. And I say, yes, it can be attainable in South Africa, but don't try it in Nigeria. In South Africa, the Electoral Commission goes to the homes of people who are unable to come out to vote on election day, especially people who are sick and they vote, as special voters. They go to hospitals and set up polling stations there for people to cast their votes. They also go to the prisons. So you see that commitment to inclusion. And that's something that Nigeria also needs to learn about early voting. You have observed elections for only God knows how long. But to a large extent, you're unable to cast your vote on election day. Why? Simply because of the nature of our electoral process. So the point is, we can't set dates where people who are on essential election duty, like journalists, like security agents, like INEC officials themselves, and election observers, and even medical practitioners, to vote early before the actual day of elections. There's also, within the South African sort of electoral commission, is this level and commitment to transparency. If you think about procurements in the Electoral Commission, they are very open. The companies that deliver services to the Electoral Commission, they are known by the people, and the Electoral Commission releases that information. There's no secrecy, about the procurement for those. And that's something our Electoral Commission can also learn, because that way you give people a sense of what the Commission is doing, and nothing is shrouded in secrecy.
Those vendors, are they South African vendors?
The majority of them are South African vendors.
And they are not under threat.
The thing about South Africa is that 100% of their elections are funded, by the state resources. 100% of their elections. And when you think about, the role that they play, it's about culture. It's about culture. And that is why, on our part as a country, we need Nigerians who are patriotic, who love their country, to uphold these values. Because if we don't get to that point, There's no way machines are going to help us do that, because if you give machines to a very corrupt and morally bankrupt person, they're going to circumvent the elections.
It will subvert the process. So I'm glad you touched the early voting thing. But there are challenges in terms of people are talking about trust, like you said, how to structure it and make it work. I know that Senator Musa Yar'Adua has a bill on that, and all of that. Is there, I need you to touch more in terms of structuring. How, because the mechanics of it is also important. How do we make it in a way that it can evince trust in majority of people? That's number one. Because it's a very short program. I also want you to leverage the time to talk about a bit on diaspora voting. What are your thoughts around that? What can we do in implementing that? And then lastly, talk about what are your most important reform issues that you think we can talk about, that we can take to the National Assembly or to INEC at this point in time.
That's quite a hard.
Yes, just squeeze it within 2 minutes.
Diaspora voting and early voting are all driven by one core principle, and that's the principle of inclusion. That as a country, we must place priority on inclusion, but more importantly, the right to vote. These are Nigerians, they have right to vote. So what we need to do when we think about policies of this nature is, how do we ensure that these Nigerians, cast their vote and not look at this policy from the risks? Because every policy, every provision on the law has its own pros and cons. And so when we build consensus that the right to vote is sacrosanct and it needs to be protected, what will we do? For early voting, we would ensure that there is aggregation of accurate data, both for persons who are in diaspora, but also people who are in essential election duty to cast their vote. You set a time, you're open, you build consensus with political parties, and ensure that prior to the day of voting, you have the total number of people who are required to vote, you publish the name, and then ensure that all different stakeholders have that information. That's how it's done in South Africa.
I get that. So let's move
to the point about the top three. I think at the heart of the reforms is the need to elevate the legal status of INEC's guidelines. That's very important. So that if INEC is introducing any reforms, it doesn't need to include or go to the National Assembly for amendment to the Electoral Act. The second critical point in terms of reform deals with the independence of INEC. The appointment of INEC, that needs to change, including the state independent electoral commissions. This culture and this practice of appointing people who have clear partisan leanings halts the independence of the electoral commission. The third sort of reform issue that is also at the heart of this is the need to address the ambiguity in the entire results collation process. Make electronic transmission mandatory, but also ensure that you do not substitute electronic transmission with manual collation. But at the end of it, if politicians don't change their attitude, we can have the best of reforms, but the quality of our elections will continue to decline.
So this is where we draw the curtain on this episode of Electoral Reform Half Hour, and is to just say special thank you to Barrister Samson Itodo, Executive Director, Yaga Africa, for your time and contributions on the program. It was an extreme pleasure having you here today.
Always a delight. Thank you.
Electoral Reform Hour is brought to you by the Peering Advocacy and Advancement Center in Africa, PACA, and with support from MacArthur Foundation. We are live every Saturday from 8:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. with a repeat broadcast every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. on same station. You can also watch on the live stream on www.youtube.com/NTA News24 Hub. Thank you for watching.